The reason that Ukraine can eventually reconquer these territories is that on a 10, 15, 20-year time horizon, we have a proven track record that Western capitalism does better than whatever Russia does.
Hi, I'm Ed D'Agostino from Malden Economics, and today I discuss the likelihood of a settlement in Ukraine and what a settlement would mean for the global world order and for investors. My guest today is the fantastic Marko Papic, Chief Strategist at BCA Research and author of the excellent book, Geopolitical Alpha. Welcome to Global Macro Update. Marko, awesome to see you. I've always wanted to have you on this podcast. Really appreciate you joining us. I'm dying to talk to you about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and I want to kind of break this conversation into two parts. The second part being what's going to happen in the markets if and when we do get a settlement. But first, I want to talk to you about your thoughts on the constraints. You're big on analyzing through the lens of constraints. What are the constraints between Russia and Ukraine, Europe, the US, all the other players, to actually getting some sort of a peace settlement negotiated?
Thanks for having me on the show, Ed. This is awesome. What I would say is that the constraints are really to the war continuing. It's not about the peace. I think that the war has to end. And quite frankly, I mean, that's not a normative statement. It's just a statement of sort of physical reality. Russia is politically unwilling to throw all of its weight behind this war. And many sort of Russia fans out there say, well, they could if they, really wanted to. It's like, nah, I don't think they can. And they can't because Ukraine's not really existential to Russia. I mean, that's going to be my first controversial hot take here. Russia can survive without it. It has nukes. They're fine. Like they lost Ukraine many, many years ago. And it's not territorial. It's not military. It's really sentiment based. Like Ukrainians don't want to live in the Russian sphere of influence. What are you going to do about that? I mean, can you really conquer a country of 42 million people and enslave them? That's difficult to do unless you're prepared to put in the kind of resources that are similar to, quite frankly, what the US did with Iraq, a much smaller country, a much weaker country than Ukraine in terms of coin operations, counterinsurgency. And so it's very expensive. So I think that Russia's fighting really an optional war. There are some things that I think are important to Moscow, like, NATO membership, that's something that I think they've proven their point. But if this was truly existential for Russia, then they would have mobilized more than just on that September 2022. That was really the only mobilization they've done. On the other hand, Ukraine, you hear in the West, you hear this view in the West that like Ukraine must win. What does that mean? At what cost to Ukraine? Like, forget about America, forget about Europe. Like, what cost to Ukraine? The territories the Ukrainians are fighting for, that Russia has effectively now occupied, they're largely insignificant. Ukraine doesn't actually need access to the Black Sea at all. The Baltic Sea is equidistant to most of Ukrainian farms as the Black Sea is. Shockingly, it's a huge country, right? So, like, it's not ideal. Don't get me wrong. It'd be better if they did have access, and they do still through Odessa, but life will go on. And the problem with the Western strategy pre-Trump has been that, like, hey, let's help Ukraine continue to fight this war. And you would go to Washington, D.C., you would talk to policymakers, particularly in the Biden administration, and you would hear things like, well, we're bleeding Russia at a low cost, like, it's great. We got them. And it's like, yeah, but actually also bleeding Ukraine.
Literally,
yes, literally. And Ukraine has far less blood than Russia does. So how are you being actually a good ally to Ukraine by encouraging this endless conflict? So in a way, Trump is, most people who are, of course, against Trump are going to say that he's doing something mean, naughty, disruptive. But I got to tell you, Ed, if Vice President Harris had won the election, I think we would be where we are today, 6 months from now, maybe, with less, obviously, meanness, and blunt statements, but I think that we'd be still here. So the war is going to end. And so I would say the material constraints, there are none to peace.
You are a former student of George Friedman from Geopolitical Futures today. Back when you knew him as he was with Straffer. He would argue that Russia has effectively lost this war. What is your take on, did Russia achieve their goals if this was an optional war to begin with?
I am a student of George Friedman. I appreciate greatly my time at Stratfor. I learned a ton from the man. And my constraint framework really is effectively what he developed. Although he would really focus on geography and technology and demographics. So what George focuses on, and most geopolitical analysts, they focus on these kind of immutable constraints, like they cannot be changed. I've extended that a little bit because I just don't think it's enough. Especially if you're an investor, like telling an investor, like, "Hey, man, Poland's got the North European plane." What does that mean? It means nothing. So you got to actually look at domestic politics too. You got to look at finance. You got to look at bond yields. You got to just extend that framework and put more tools into your toolbox. I would say that George is 100% right. Now, the question is Putin the same as Russia? And very rarely is that the case. And this is where I think we have to become tool-level strategists. There's this concept in political science introduced by many American political scientists because they were frustrated by all the IR theorists walking around talking about geopolitics, They said, like, hey, man, you got to look at domestic politics too. And I think Putin is playing a tool-level game, as everybody is. President Trump is as well. From a domestic political perspective, I think Putin got what he needed from Ukraine and the invasion. If you remember, in 2022, actually, he was on thin ice. Russian response to COVID was probably the worst in the world. In 2019, he actually launched a bunch of establishment, OECD, IMF-approved structural reforms that were extremely, extremely unpopular. So he was actually facing widespread protests across the country, and he did what he does best, export that volatility in his near abroad. And so a lot of Americans see this as some sort of a geopolitical chessboard, but actually he had a domestic political logic for doing that. So on that front, maybe I would say, he got what he needed, but did Russia as a country lose? Of course. Of course, the territories they acquired from Ukraine are just not that useful. But the good news is they can declare victory. I think that's, from a political perspective domestically, I think Putin can still declare victory, say they got Novaya Rossiya and, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk.
What do you think Putin lost? I mean, he was almost overthrown at one point, right? I mean, there was a coup attempt.
Well, I mean, and that's not a good sign. So we can look at that both ways. We can say like, well, he defeated the coup. On the other hand, like, hey, there was a coup, that's not a good news. It's not a good thing when a country that was a few years ago was like a G8 member, like one of the most sophisticated advanced economies in the world. And at one point, because of this war, they had bulldozers ripping up highways outside of Moscow
to stop the advance of a potential coup, right?
Yeah, and so now somebody can say, well, come on, like they defeated Wagner easily. I'm like, yeah, but like they were like imagine if like here in Los Angeles they start ripping apart, I-10, I'm not taking that as they're like, oh, everything is fine. That's the first thing. But the second thing, I think, look, like Ukraine's NATO membership, fine, I get that. It irks Russia. Go to war for it. Whatever. I'm not going to, eat your lunch for that. But the reality is like the territories they're winning that they've occupied, like there is nothing there. And please don't tell me about coal or neon gas. Like this is nonsense. We're not in the 19th century. There is nothing in Donetsk and Luhansk. This is a joke. Nobody needs any of these territories. So the fact that they went out, Crimea, but there's Sevastopol, Marco, the Black Sea Fleet. The Black Sea Fleet. Go to Wikipedia. Do an order of battle analysis, and what will you find out? You'll find out that the Greek Navy could sink the Russian Black Sea Fleet in 24 hours. This is a joke. The Black Sea is irrelevant. We're not playing Risk. It's not the 19th century. It's not the 19th century. Black Sea is a lake inside another lake that is absolutely controlled by NATO, by Europe, by the US, whoever you want. So to me, this was a war of choice. And so I do think Russia as a country extended way too many resources to get way too little. And it's funny because if you look at Putin's career, the one thing you can say about Putin is that unlike George Bush Jr., unlike Barack Obama, Putin had a very high geopolitical ROI. For a very small investment in Syria, he managed to keep Assad in power for a very long time. Now, he's had to pull some of those troops away, Assad falls. Georgia, intervention in 2008, very small, very small investment, huge investment return. And even the 2014-15 intervention in Ukraine, done with sort of plausible deniability, he's always been very careful. Chechnya, his first foray into geopolitics, he actually got one group of Chechens to fight another. That's how the Russians ultimately won a war they lost. So he's always been cautious, always been smart, small incursions, cheap, huge ROI. And in Ukraine, I think he deviated from that model. And so that was the problem.
So you think that a settlement of some sort is it inevitable and imminent?
Yes, it is. And again, it's, can Russians continue to grind this, and acquire square miles of Ukrainian territory endlessly? Yes. To great loss to themselves, because again, what's the point? And also the question for me would be, what do you do with 40 million Ukrainians if you were ever to conquer them all? This is a lot for a country to swallow, the country the size of Russia. If the United States of America struggled to pacify Iraq, how are you going to pacify 40 million people who hate you? It's just very difficult. So that's the first thing. I think that the reason I think the settlement is inevitable, however, is on the Ukrainian side. And so when you give a blank check to somebody, they're obviously going to try to cash it in. And what President Trump has done, he has effectively said to Ukraine, for your own sake, and this is where I'm going to get a lot of people, send us hate mail here, but I truly believe that for Ukraine's sake, U.S. is taking away the blank check. You don't have the resources domestically. And, the fight between Zelensky, Putin, and J.D. Vance in the White House, decorum was lost, a lot of things were said. But one of the things that J.D. Vance at one point was trying to say was hey, look, you're struggling to mobilize your own troops. And then Zelensky counters with this flippant, well, have you been to the front line? J.D. Vance doesn't have to be at the front line. We all know that in 2024, Ukraine struggled to pass a mobilization bill through its own parliament. I'm sorry, if these territories are existential to Ukraine, then I would assume it would be easy to mobilize men of Ukraine who are patriotic to their country. But it isn't, because these territories are not existential. And so I think on both sides, you're starting to see war fatigue. And I think one of the reasons for that, there's many reasons, but one of them that we don't maybe discuss enough is that I do think that defensive military technology has actually surpassed offensive. And so it's really difficult to launch, these offensives, whether you're Ukraine or whether you're Russia.
Interesting. So you just end up with battlefield stalemates.
Yes, unless you launch, a surprise attack that maybe you don't expect, or you put in enough troops behind it. But if you're not willing politically to put in enough men behind an offensive, it's going to be very difficult. And so there's also this narrative, had we given Ukraine weapons early in the conflict? I think this is also unfair, and it's unfair to the Biden administration. Had the U.S. given Ukraine F-16s day one, they would have been shot down by S-400s, fired outside from Russian territory. So Russia has coverage of its air defense systems over Ukraine. You cannot give Ukraine F-16s. It's like giving my son a Bloomberg terminal. What is he going to do with it? Russians can shoot down a Ukrainian F-16 that flies over Ukrainian airspace. What you would need to do is you would need to authorize Ukraine or do it for them, what's called the suppression of enemy air defense operations, SAD operations, which require you to fly into Russian airspace and use HARM missiles to take out their radar installations, which leads to you and me being in a bunker.
Right.
So, this is a very flippant narrative out there. Biden could have done more tanks. The advent of drones, the advent of very sophisticated air defense systems, and the cheapness of anti-tank missiles, like javelins. And by the way, Russians have their own version of that. it makes it very difficult to play offense, both for Russians, thankfully for Ukraine, but it also makes it difficult for Ukraine. So just endlessly pouring cash into Ukraine to continue the war is, I think, not good for Ukraine. And so I think that's where we are. What's a better strategy? Am I just sort of ignorant or no, not ignorant? Am I just callous? Am I just telling you nothing can be done? No, I think there is a playbook for defeating Russia. It's worked in the past. It's called West Germany. The reason that Ukraine can eventually reconquer these territories is that on a 10, 15, 20-year time horizon, we have a proven track record that Western capitalism does better than whatever Russia does. And so what happened in West Germany over the course of the Cold War is that, the economy was much more superior. It had access to global markets, and you could buy a BMW, an Audi, an Opel, a Mercedes-Benz, whereas in East Germany, you had to wait for a Warburg for 18 years. And that's going to be the case again. So the faster the West just transitions to helping Ukraine integrate into the global economy, the better. Like that is the path to victory and reconquering these territories, where one day the people of Zaporizhia or Kherson are like, wait, what the hell are we doing here?
So let's talk a little bit about what I don't really hear many people talking about, and that is post-settlement. What does the world look like? What are the knock-on effects of a settlement? Because from an investor's perspective, I think they could actually be pretty significant. I mean, for example, does the world welcome Russia back with their oil, the third largest oil producer in the world? Does the world open their arms and say, we're going to start buying your oil at market prices again? Does Europe start buying natural gas again? I mean, let's start with energy and just kind of work our way through. What are the impacts of a settlement?
Well, can we start with geopolitics first and then go?
We can start wherever you want.
I want to nail this down because, the first 10, 15 minutes of this conversation, I've probably already confused people. I don't think Russia has won, but I also think the West made a mistake arming Ukraine effectively. Where's this guy? Well, I'm nowhere. I'm bathed in aloof indifference. So I'm just trying to kind of get the markets right. And that's a great anchor. Like if you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking, where does Marco come from? What is his sort of anchor? I have only one, which is making my clients money. Now, it's very petty, it's very glib, but it's an unbiased one. And that's why I think that anyone listening to this interview can't really tell, which side I'm on. So let's talk about that from a geopolitical perspective. I don't think Ukraine changed anything.
Interesting. Okay.
I think the world has been multipolar for 10, 15 years now. I don't know. It's hard to say. And this is really important because multipolarity is a dirty word in America.
It's also a misunderstood word. You should define multipolar, your definition of multipolar, if you would.
Super, yes. And of course, I'm just stealing this from political science, so I didn't invent this. But the word multipolar is quite often uttered by, the Kremlin, China. They like to claim the world is multipolar because obviously that means hey, I get to be asked something and, my interests also matter. So there's really three ways the world can be, the global power can be redistributed through states. Unipolar world, that means there's one bully in the world. It's actually very, very good for investors to have a unipolar system because it's stable. And you can follow the rules and norms that you learn as an investor what to do and what not to do. So that's a very simple system. It also leads to globalized economic outcomes, like the economy is integrated because, again, there's a rule system that's enforced by the hegemon, by the global superpower. A bipolar world, most Americans are very familiar with this world because, of course, they won the Cold War. It's fresh in people's minds. That means there's two countries. They tend to split the world into two zones. Those two zones don't talk to each other. A lot of investors thought from 2016, 17, 18 to probably just until a few years ago that we were headed towards that bifurcation. I disagree because I don't think the United States of America and China are powerful enough to control their allied systems. They're not strong enough to enforce compliance with a bipolar structure. And actually, bipolar structure is very rare product in global history. Soviet Union and the United States were able to impose that on the rest of the planet because you have to understand the starting conditions in 1945 were such that Europe was decimated, tens of millions of refugees. Japan had 2 nuclear devices dropped on it. India was still a colony of a tired, almost defeated nation. And then you had China, of course, which was eviscerated by its conflict with Japan and was mired in a civil war. So starting conditions matter, and Soviet Union and the US were the only 2 games in town. Multipolar world is a world where there is nobody really in charge. Now, that is not to say, and this is where Americans usually get set off, because it's like, oh, we're the strongest country in the world, 11 aircraft carriers. And it's like, yes, fair. It doesn't mean that the United States of America is not number one. And it is not head and shoulders above every other country on the planet. It is. And I can quantifiably measure and prove this. But to enforce hegemony, to enforce a unipolar world, you need to be head, shoulder, torso, and hips above everyone else. It's the kind of power that comes with picking up a phone and saying, hey, bro, you're going to do X. Or I'm going to, I don't know, crush your currency. Like what the US did to Great Britain when it forced it to pull out of the Suez in the 50s with Israel and France. All it took was a phone call. Like, what are you doing? Oh, me and my buddies, we want Suez. No, click. So the world we have today is a complicated one. It's a multipolar one. And I think what Russian invasion of Ukraine shows is that, number one, we are in a multipolar world. Countries have these independent dynamics, but also the outcome of this conflict will ossify it. A lot of the things that President Trump is doing right now is going to actually entrench multipolarity and is going to ossify that outcome. And I don't think that's necessarily that bad, either for humanity, quite frankly, or for investors.
If you're enjoying this conversation, please take a minute to give us a like and subscribe to the channel. Doing that really helps us grow, so I very much appreciate your help and your support. Now back to our talk with Marko Papic. So does the settlement change nothing? Or on the margins, are there going to be some impacts like, and I'm just guessing, cheaper oil?
So first of all, I don't think so. I think oil prices have declined. It's now, we're recording this on March 21st. So oil prices have been pretty weak for the first part of 2025. And I think the reason for that is a mix of 2 views. One, I understand there's recession probability has gone up. The other one is geopolitics, particularly this idea, as you said, like Russia is going to be reintegrated. But the issue, Ed, is that Russia is not going to export a single extra barrel of oil because the war ends. I mean, they're already exporting maximum amount. There was a little bit at the end of the Biden administration risk premium because of the intense sanctions against its shadow tanker fleet. So maybe there's some relief there. But for the most part, as we all know, Russia has exported the exact same amount of oil as it did pre-invasion. The only difference is piped oil to Europe, and then it was at a different price. If anything, if Russia suddenly can charge market prices for its crude, I don't think you're going to see a surge in production in Russia. Russia doesn't have the kind of flex that Saudi Arabia has. I think what you will see is that the blended global price will probably rise because suddenly there isn't really that much of a disadvantage or advantage in buying Russian crude if you're India. Suddenly it's just like the global price of oil actually has to go up because you don't have this pool of artificially suppressed price. So from a geopolitical perspective, I would actually say next 3 months, what happens in the Middle East with Iran is probably going to have more upside. Now, your other question was energy with LNG. What's happening with natural gas? What if Russia restarts natural gas? Well, there is still a pipeline through Poland that can be activated very quickly. There are no sanctions on natural gas exports from Russia to Europe. It's really just voluntary Russian embargo against Europe.
Okay.
Will Europeans take this gas? Yeah, I think so. But a very misunderstood and under-researched part of the European bullish story. Everyone's looking at German fiscal policy and rearmament and sort of this kind of like European enthusiasm because they need to now do something. But there is another pillar, and it's the fact that too many LNG suppliers have overbuilt supply over the last 5 years. There's way too much LNG supply coming online over the next 12 to 24 months. You've got Qatar, you've got Mozambique, you've got British Columbia, you've got US, you've got Russia, all bringing supply online. And so I believe, my view, is that European energy costs are going to collapse. Their electricity costs are going to completely collapse. The deindustrialization narrative is going to fall on its head. And Europe will be drowned in a tsunami wave of LNG over the next few years. So I'm not even sure if they will have to take the Russian gas. And by the way, Russia's participating in this LNG free-for-all because most of their gas that they used to send through pipelines to Europe is stuck in the European Arctic, in the Yamal Peninsula. And this notion that they can deviate it to China is nonsense. China doesn't want to pay for $500 billion pipeline. It's a fixed asset in a country where you don't want to fix anything to the ground, Russia. The Chinese are not dumb. And so the issue is that Russia has just realized, the easiest way for us to get this gas out of here is LNG. But then what they do is they just add more to this glut that's coming.
So how about agricultural products? Ukraine, huge producer of grains.
I think it's going to be very difficult for Russia to increase its supply of oil. So that's kind of the point. The supply stays the same, higher price for oil in Russia. I don't think it incentivizes anyone to invest in Russia. But that may not be the case with agricultural products. I think that reduction of tensions on both countries, I think, will lead to further, yields. We've seen Russia actually increase its agricultural productivity massively over the last 10 years. That's been one of their success stories, actually, of Russia. And so, yes, I do think that this could be positive for sort of global supply. But, as you probably know, Ed, there's been a huge productivity boost in agriculture over the last 20 years.
Incredible.
It's been really hurting soft prices across the board, whether you're talking about fruits, whether you're talking about grains. And so I'm not sure that anybody who's in that business is listening to this and they're just like, oh, great. Yet another headwind to prices.
Who do you think rebuilds Ukraine? And is that an investable option?
I think anyone listening to this interview, I think that's going to be difficult. That's going to be difficult for investors to participate in. I think, but yes, I do think it's going to be Europe mainly.
Poland? Will Poland be a big winner?
Sure, it will be, but you got to be very careful. I mean, you have to look at Polish equity index, and you have to understand that you're probably mainly investing in banks.
Yeah.
Yeah, as is always the case. So be very, 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 very cautious of this. I think there's an easier way to play peace in Ukraine, and I've been articulating this thesis for the past 12 months. I've been very bullish Europe for the past 12 months. Again, it's not based on German fiscal spending. I'm actually annoyed at the German fiscal spending story, Ed, because I sell stories for a living. Let's be honest. I sell stories to hedge funds and pension funds, and when a story is over within 6 months, you're like,
I need a new story.
I thought I had at least, I thought I had 12 months on this, and then the Germans come out and they're like, we agree. It's like, oh, no, you're supposed to be depressed and not agree. So I think the enthusiasm for Europe is worrying me a little bit now. I think it's kind of gone into overdrive, but I do think that there's a bevy of reasons to be bullish Europe. One of which is, of course, the settlement of a conflict with a nuclear power on its periphery. That seems like a pretty important thing. But you know why? It's not so much, Ed, because there's going to be rebuilding of Ukraine leads to higher earnings for companies X. Although, yes, maybe that too. It's more, I've talked to a lot of wealth managers in Europe, big ones, managing trillions of dollars of high net worth assets. And what they've pointed out to me is when Russia invaded Ukraine, constraints aside, cool heads aside, hey guys, it's not that big of a deal. It's going to be in part of Ukraine. It doesn't matter. Nuclear weapons are not going to be used. If you're a high net worth individual domiciled in Europe, you're buying Netflix. You're selling everything you own and you're going and you're buying S&P 500 big tech. There was a... I'm sorry about that. I have a giant lion in my house. So
that's great.
I don't know if people are going to cut that out or not, or maybe keep
I think
it.
It's funny.
It's funny. Also, he clearly doesn't agree with me. He's a big tech investor. He wants to hold on to his Mag 7 position. But the truth is, there was a safe haven flow out of Europe, and it's something that a lot of wealth managers and asset managers noted, it basically transitioned to the US as a result. It was part of the bull market, I think, in the US for the past 5 years, which itself is based on the AI, narrative, I would call bubble, fiscal policy in the US, and then finally this kind of safe haven flow due to geopolitical risks.
So you think that that unwinds?
I wouldn't be short US stocks because Russia and Ukraine, get a peace deal, but I am underweight US relative to global. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of them is that as Trump establishes geopolitical equilibria, ironically, he reduces the need to hold US assets as a safe haven. And by the way, that is an interesting difference between disorganized multipolar world and a balanced one. A disorganized, unbalanced multipolar world, wars are popping up all the time. Countries are trying to compete with sphere of influence, pushing against one another. That increases risks. Investors want safety. And what's safer than a bunch of tech stocks in America? But if there is a balanced multipolarity, kind of like the concert of Europe of the 19th century, you don't necessarily need the safety of tech companies. You can start looking at maybe Poland benefits from Ukraine. Maybe Indonesia benefits from tech dissemination out of China. You can then start thinking about other things other than, am I going to survive World War III?
So do you think that Europe can be cohesive enough to compete as a bloc on the world stage, in this environment where they're getting so much pressure from President Trump right now?
I think pressure builds diamonds, Ed, and necessity is the mother of all innovation. I think this view that Europe would deindustrialize due to the electricity prices is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard in my life. It's on the cover of The Economist. Push against that view. It's a generational investment opportunity for anyone watching this. Anyone who tells you the Germans are just going to lay down and deindustrialize, which part of German history teaches you that part? You know what I mean? I'm just going to leave it there. But I think there's more to it. Even if the endeavor fails in 5 to 10 years, given the valuation disadvantage between Europe and the US right now, it plays for investors. It is going to pay to play their attempt to not go gently into that good night. And they're clearly attempting to do that. Now, I will say a couple of things. From history, we know that fear is a great unifier. It's not love. It's not love. It's not loyalty. It's not common cause. No. It's fear. If there was no United Kingdom, and if the United Kingdom did not control more than half of North American continent, I don't think we would have United States of America. You know why? Why can't Pennsylvania and New York be separate countries? Like Australia and Canada are not in a country. These were all British colonies. If there was absolutely no threat from the United Kingdom, after the Revolutionary War, if you think about it, there was imminent threat of reinvasion by the United Kingdom. Imminent. Now, forget France, forget Spain, forget, whatever, Native Americans. It was, the United Kingdom's going to come back. They're going to want this, which led to the integration of the 13 colonies. Similarly, in Europe, you've had very similar unification efforts, like German states, German-speaking states, principalities, kingdoms. They were very fine being divided and separated into Prussia, into this, that, and the other. And then effectively, it was feared that Napoleon-like nationalist movements would return that led Germany to slowly contemplate hey, we probably do need to adopt this new operating system of nationalism and adopt it to our dynastic countries. Switzerland, another example. Fear led to the cantons coming together from Austria-Hungary, from France, from others. Repeatedly throughout human history, it is fear of the outside world that leads to actually sustainable confederations and federations. And I think Europe is finally realizing that, not only does Russia not mean you good, but even an ally you thought was on your side is going to pursue their own national interests, because ultimately that's what happens in a multipolar world. Countries kind of tone down their magnanimity and increase their Machiavellianism.
That's a hot take. Even with all the different languages of Europe and all the history of war amongst themselves, you think that these events are going to bring Europe even closer?
First of all, we've had the euro area crisis. Everyone said Europe would collapse. It didn't. The support for Europe and European integration is at like 85%, 85%, depending on the country. Even in Germany, where 30% of the public voted for anti-establishment parties, the support for the euro is at 85%. How does that mathematically make sense? It makes sense because a lot of people voting for anti-establishment parties are voting for them because they're anti-immigrant. They don't want any more immigration. They're not anti-integration. So first of all, the track record of the 10 years tells us that a huge economic calamity didn't produce a collapse of Europe. Like the euro area expanded, the UK left, but the euro area actually expanded in the middle of the crisis. But the second point I would say is that, absolutely, history tells us that even quite differentiated entities can actually amalgamate. Most European countries were extremely culturally, linguistically heterogeneous. Italy is a great example of this. But so is France. Through a process of integration, France actually suppressed different linguistic variants of French and versions of Catalan. That's why today everyone speaks Ile-de-France French, but that wasn't the case when they started actually suppressing other forms of linguistic variation. So yeah, I think that it's modern world, it's 2025. Use Google Translate if you need to. For the sake of competing with the rest of the world, I think it's self-evident what needs to happen. And I think what you're going to see is a different kind of Euroscepticism in Europe. It's not the Euroscepticism of let's blow this thing apart. Many will make the choices that Giorgia Meloni and Marine Le Pen made, which is look, I am Eurosceptic because I don't like the bureaucrats in Brussels. But that's the same type of Euroscepticism that Charles de Gaulle had.
Interesting.
He was a Eurosceptic. Yeah, he didn't like the bureaucrats, measuring size or curvatures of bananas. That was his problem. But he wasn't anti-European integration. In fact, don't forget, he warned Europeans, Americans are not your friends. We need to integrate because nobody has their interests other than each other. So that was an interesting kind of way to think about it. A Gaullist Euroscepticism means more integration, but perhaps more, bureaucracy bashing, which is,
we all like to do that.
En mode. En mode. Yeah.
I think I think a lot of especially individual investors are very underexposed, if not have no exposure to Europe at all. So I think you've done people a real service by presenting this argument. Your work has really helped me think about how to interpret the signals coming from the world, starting with your great book, Geopolitical Alpha, one of my favorites in the space. Really appreciate it. How else can people learn about you and your work? You're at BCA. I know you have some podcasts. Where can we find you?
So, my day job is to work with professional investors. And I'm I have this kind of a schizophrenic view. I focus on 0 to 3 months for my hedge fund clients and then 5 to 10 years for sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. And one thing I just want to say, Ed, it's not just individual investors that are underexposed to Europe. I mean, it is the entire, I think, sovereign wealth fund and pension fund community. So this is something that, they're not alone out there. And so taking a first step would be a good move. In terms of where else you can reach me, I actually just started a podcast with a former colleague of mine, Jacob Shapiro, the man with the smoothest voice.
Like butter.
Like butter. So Jacob and I started a podcast called Geopolitical Cousins.
I listened to the first one last night. It was fabulous. Jacob, we're big fans of Jacob, so congratulations on that.
I love Jacob. We actually worked at Stratford together and then just kept in touch for a while. He made the similar shift that I did. So he left the pure sort of political risk consulting world and entered finance. And I like that because, again, our anchor is really just trying to get the markets right. This isn't about who we want to win. It's not about the next 10 years either. Our performance is measured by our clients, whether we made them money or not. And that's where you're kind of kept honest. Doesn't mean that we don't make the mistakes, of course, but that podcast itself will focus mostly on geopolitics. So it's not really intended to be listened to by investors, but I think it will be funny. I think it'll be entertaining, and we're trying to disseminate global events in this sort of non-biased, very bizarre perspective that we both have.
And there's one more place that viewers can find Marco Papic, and that's the Strategic Investment Conference. You're going to be joining us at the SIC this year for the first time in May. So really looking forward to seeing you there as well.
Same, and thank you so much to you and John for the invitation.